and welcome to this special Procurement Act podcast mini-series brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. This series is supported by Procurement Hub. Welcome to our fourth and final episode of this CIPS Procurement Act mini-series, partnered with Procurement Hub, part of Places for People. We're going to finish this series by talking about how the Act will open up opportunities for public sector procurement. Thank you again to our expert speakers for joining us. As a reminder, that's Alan Heron, Director of Procurement at Places for People, and Rebecca Rees, Partner and Head of Procurement at international law firm Trowers and Hamlins. Welcome again both. Thank you very much for joining us again, sharing your expertise. Alan, if I can start with you on this particular topic, from your perspective, what does the opening up of public sector procurement mean, and why is that necessary?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's a couple of ways we could look at what do we mean by the opening up of public sector procurement. We've touched upon the transparency obligations of the new Act, and in one sense, that's quite a significant opening up of public sector procurement. It's taking a very much an open book approach to the entire procurement life cycle, from establishing a need for a requirement and publishing a need for a procurement exercise, all the way through to the procurement life cycle, performance, and indeed the conclusion of the contracts themselves. So it really is quite a holistic view of public sector procurement that will be available for anyone to see for the first time, really, under the new legislation. So that's quite a significant way in which the legislation opens up public sector procurement. But I think there's another aspect to it as well in terms of the opening up of public sector procurement. There's there's something called the competitive flexible procedure, which is being introduced in the new legislation. And I think from a practitioner's perspective, it opens up the legislation in terms of flexibility. I think it affords us much more manoeuvrability and control over the procurement processes that we use. And I think for me, it's one of the highlights of the legislation, giving us more control and allowing us to ensure that the procurements that we run are actually reflective of the requirements that we have as organisations, because the public sector is quite diverse with quite distinct and different requirements and needs and contextual environments. And I think having the flexibility of tools like the competitive flexible procedure really open up the procurement process and allow us to reflect that individuality of different aspects of the sector, and making sure that the procurement that we run is tailored to the specific needs of the organisation and its environment.
Great stuff. Rebecca, what are the mechanisms the Act is putting in place to open up public sector procurement? If you can go into some specifics for us.
I think in terms of the Procurement Act generally, when I read it, given that it's drafted by the Cabinet Office, I really see synergies of it between the processes that the Procurement Act puts in place and the playbooks that have been published for use by largely central government departments, but of course everybody can access the goodies that are in those playbooks. So what do I mean by that? I think a lot of the procurement practice envisaged by the Act is scaffolded by those tools. So when we look at opening up the market, the playbook obliges contracting authorities to do, for example, a market health assessment. So as Alan says, know who your market is. And that's really useful when you get, as Alan talked about, the competitive flexible procedure, to designing the competition, so that you can design a proportionate competition that will be attractive to, aka open up the market to your relevant marketplace that you want to attract. Likewise, looking at pipeline notices and making sure that contracting authorities advertise the opportunities through an accessible shop front, like the pipeline notice will provide on the central digital platform. So everybody knows where to go to look at the opportunities for the public sector. So in terms of practicalities on how to open up the market, do look at the playbooks and the tools that gives you. It also has delivery model assessments, how you're going to contract. Remember, there is a big push for pre-market engagement as well, so that you can, bidders can get a chance to really put their stall across to contracting authorities. With a word of warning, contracting authorities use that sensibly. Don't go and nick all of their good ideas and replay them back to the competitors. Use it to shape the procurement opportunity and the process carefully. The other thing I would say is that, remember, there's the lotting ability. So to take a large contract and look at delivering it via a series of smaller lots to open up the market to SMEs, new entrants, and those bidders that might not necessarily have the appetite for a whacking great big public sector project.
Yeah, excellent stuff. Alan, we touched on it briefly on our previous podcast where we talked about professionalism, but there will be some new skills required for procurement practitioners, and maybe not new skills, but skills that they've had in their armory but haven't had the opportunity to use for a while. And I appreciate that not everyone who works in the public sector procurement has always had a long history of that. Some people have come from different sectors into that and vice versa. But what new skills will be required from practitioners to take advantage of the new opportunities that the Act opens? So negotiation skills, for example. And how can teams start to prepare for this?
I think it's really intriguing that the notion of new skills and new flexibilities that the Act brings into place. In some respects, I would probably suggest that the Act is actually catching up with the practicalities of what's actually happening under the current legislation. To say that negotiation doesn't exist under the current legislation is probably naive. I think it certainly does. To what degree it exists certainly is questionable, but negotiation definitely exists under the current legislation. I think it's enabled more under the new legislation. But there are things like dynamic markets, for example. Opening up the scope of dynamic markets is simply the legislation catching up with what's already happening and reflecting the current behaviour. So I think a lot of these new attributes of the Act are actually just the Act catching up with the practicalities of what's already happening. But it is a good point, a lot of organisations will have staff that haven't honed their negotiation skills as often because it wasn't as prominent under the current legislation, or it hasn't certainly been given the sort of spotlight that it has under the new Act. But for me, a lot of the skills are about understanding the Act, having foresight, and planning your procurement to get the best results. Because for me, the magic happens in the preparation. It's understanding how you put the contract together, how you put the tender documentation together, understanding the implications of that, understanding the limitations of that, and having the foresight to play out all those variables as you're putting together the documentation. And a lot of that will come with experience. Some things can't be taught, but I think there are a lot of really good online courses out there. I think, to be fair, the Cabinet Office has done a fantastic job in some of the e-learning they've got in place at the moment for the new Act. It doesn't encompass everything, like the softer skills like negotiation. Obviously, there are multitudes of courses out there for negotiation skills. But for me, one of the key factors that organisations need to think about is having some creativity and not being afraid, to test the boundaries a little bit, and don't throw away the opportunity that the legislation affords us in terms of the competitive flexible procedure, for example. We have the ability to create something bespoke and create something that is innovative and will challenge us and challenge the supply chain and bring results that previously weren't available to us under the current legislation. So I think for me, be brave, be confident, and have some creativity and what you want from your organisation, and don't be afraid to innovate.
Absolutely. I think as much as anything, a part of this change program, it's a culture change, isn't it? I mean, the Act will allow people to flex more commercial acumen and pull different levers. So it's not only honing those skill sets, but also kind of that bravery, isn't it? That bold step into kind of what the art of the possible could possibly be under the new regime. Rebecca, what provisions are in place to work with different types of suppliers, such as SMEs and local suppliers, etc.?
I mean, there's the procurement objective at section 12, which sort of obliges the contracting authority to have regard to the fact that SMEs may face particular barriers to participation. And then they have to consider whether those barriers can be removed or reduced. Now, we probably go back to what you and Alan have just been talking about, custom and practice and how we do that. And it does take an energetic procurement officer to look at what's on their desk and say, okay, well, what is useful for SMEs here? I'm just about to put out this big contract. How could I include SMEs in here so that they don't just have to make up the tier 2, tier 3 supply chain, that they could actually bid direct for this opportunity? So in terms of specific provisions, we've got sort of procurement law, LORE, custom and practice, underpinned by a non kind of enforceable procurement objective. So we need to, use that custom and practice to sort of do things differently. And I think that it probably goes back to what you were talking about in seeing the reforms as the art of the possible and being able to say, well, why can't I do that? Because the Procurement Act is rather light on below threshold contracts and how you, flex your procurement procedures to make them SME friendly. But that means that they've left it to the individual contracting authority to work their magic each time they go out the procurement to ensure that they are opening up the opportunities to new entrants, female-led businesses, and all of the other kind of participants in the procurement landscape that don't often get the look in that the larger tier ones and nationals, multinationals do. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great stuff. I think it's an exciting time for smaller suppliers. Hopefully they see that opportunity.
I think it is an opportunity, just to butt in there, but procurement reform is, we have, for example, taken what was a fairly well understood set of procurement rules and changed their vocabulary, changed their taxonomy. We haven't been clear in guidance as to how the new rules should be interpreted. So you do have a lot of lawyers going around saying, oh, well, the words are different. It means something different. Well, not always, and not often, actually. And that's probably set back even experienced SME bidders into the realms of, L&D again. And remember, the Cabinet Office guidance and training the training sessions that Alan mentioned aren't available to bidders. They have to self-start and get up to speed with all of these reforms now whilst doing their day job often. So I think that, we have to be, as contracting authorities, slightly sympathetic to particularly smaller bidders who don't have that resource to get to grips with the legislation and almost take them through the first few competitive flexible procedures or open procedures, whatever, because otherwise they will see, those barriers that this is supposed to remove and put back in place again, but just in UK specific language.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, I've over the years, I've seen some really smart uses of SMEs and SME engagement across the public sector. So some of this, again, is this whole culture change and hearts and minds, and hopefully the step change of a new act will make SMEs think twice about the possibilities of contracting with the public sector. So maybe this the fact that it's a new act will hopefully engage people to realise that actually it is possible, what the art of the possible is. Great stuff. So, given this is the last episode of our 4-part series, and we've covered the why we've got the Act in place, transparency in our episode 2, integrity and professionalism, and then in today's episode we've talked about opening up. I thought it would be a good idea to ask each of you for your summary thoughts, I guess, to how we can kind of draw these discussions to a close. If you can, would you summarise the impact of the Procurement Act and what it's expected to have on public sector procurement, including contracting authorities and suppliers? I know that's kind of a big ask to summarise this whole series down into a few words, but Rebecca, if I could come to you first.
The Procurement Act, I think for many reasons, wasn't needed. But in terms of it actually being here, I think it has been fantastic in convincing C-suite and the larger population as to what we already knew, which is procurement is the centre of the universe. It touches everything, and good procurement can really be transformative. So the fact that these procurement reforms have put procurement fully in that discussion space, and the changes that has created in the conversations we've been able to have and who we've been able to have them with has been fantastic. So for me, the focus on the benefits of procurement done well has been the success of the Procurement Act so far, regardless of what impact it has. I think that the impact that it has will improve because everybody has been energised. They've had a lot of learning and development. I think skills will keep on increasing and improving, and capacity and capability in the sector can only go one way now. So I think that that new energised conversation has been the greatest impact so far.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think it's a great opportunity for organisations such as CIPS and the Procurement Hub to showcase these great stories, the storytelling and the case studies around that, what can be unlocked, and the power behind public sector procurement, the value that can be unlocked. It would be a really great outcome for us to continue to hit that drum beat on that. So yes, definitely I agree with you on that. Alan, what are your final thoughts?
I would probably echo everything Rebecca said, but from a practical perspective, I think one of the things we haven't touched upon is that the next 4 years is going to be incredibly challenging, because for the next 4 years, we're going to have an environment where we've got some frameworks, contracts, and dynamic purchasing systems or dynamic markets that are bound by the previous legislation, and we're going to have another suite that are bound by the new Procurement Act. So for the next 4 years, we're potentially going to be operating under 2 different sets of legislation. And those 2 sets of legislation are conflicting in some regards. I mean, Rebecca touched upon before some of the terminology used is quite in contrast with the other sets of legislation. So there's going to be quite a complex environment to navigate for the next 4 years, which is difficult enough for procurement professionals alone. But given that the new obligations of the Act mean that we have to ensure that there's an awareness and understanding of the Act beyond the procurement departments into the functional areas of our businesses and organisations and the finance departments so that they understand their obligations, it's going to be quite a complex conversation, and we need to tread very carefully to make sure that the appropriate people have access to the appropriate information. So I think fundamentally, I would urge everyone to understand as much about the Procurement Act as possible, to absolutely consume every last morsel of training and available resources that there is on the new Act, because as a key part of the procurement infrastructure, you're really going to have a really sound knowledge of what is pertinent for your organisation and what the practicalities are of the new Act moving forward. I think the new Act will bring forward some really interesting challenges in terms of capacity. Some of the transparency obligations are quite numerous, and I think there will be real capacity challenges in the sector. But having said that, there are some really good opportunities in terms of flexibility, innovation, creativity moving forward with the tools that are in the new legislation. And as Rebecca said, that the transformation of procurement in terms of its profile and awareness within organisations, and the undoubtedly increasing amount of sort of upskilling and knowledge transfer that's happening in the wake of the Procurement Act is something that we should continue to build upon and make sure it's not just a one-time scenario. And procurement should really strive to make sure that this continuous improvement and professionalism is something that we make sure is an ongoing aspect of what we do.
Absolutely, 100%. And yes, this is going to be a real challenging, very, very busy time for public sector procurement people. Thank you both for sharing your insights and expertise in this series. I'm confident that many listeners would have taken a lot away from this and gone that way to help them prepare a little bit more about the challenges ahead. But Rebecca, Alan, thank you very much for your expertise and joining us. I'm sure many of our listeners have taken a lot away from this series, and it will have helped them prepare a little bit more for the challenges ahead as a result of the Procurement Act legislation. As a reminder from our first episode, the go-live date is now the 24th of February 2025. You can find lots of information on the gov.uk website. The Cabinet Office has pulled together loads of e-learning modules, as well as knowledge drops as part of the training available to prepare you and your team for what's ahead. Our learning and development team at CIPS is also here to help, and don't forget to engage with our CIPS community platform to find out how others are embracing the new opportunities and tackling any challenges that arise. So that's it for this CIPS Futures Procurement Act podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it, and do let us know your thoughts on any other topics that might be good to cover in a similar format. And don't forget to rate and review us. Many thanks to Procurement Hub for supporting this CIPS Futures series. Part of Places for People, Procurement Hub are a commercially sensitive procurement consortium with giving back and social purpose at the forefront. You can download their guide on public sector procurement over on the CIPS Download website. This podcast has been brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. For more information on CIPS, head over to cips.org, where you can find out about our up-and-coming events and all the excellent training opportunities on offer. Until next time, see you then.